I've argued over the course of the time that I've had this channel that the Trump and Russia stuff is a Trojan horse. It's a Trojan horse on 2 points. On the first point, it's rather obvious. Donald Trump is illegitimate, meaning it's delegitimized as a president of the United States. He didn't win on his own merits. He won through Vladimir Putin putting him on his shoulder and just kind of running him across the finish line. That evokes a certain imagery of cheating and all this other stuff. Now, truth of the matter is, Donald Trump was helped over the finish line. It was not Vladimir Putin that helped over the finish line. It was the other Republicans in the various states where they were able to shave off enough votes and suppress the vote total in those states to allow him to win. The number of people that would shave off the rolls or suppressed was more than the victory margin that Trump won in many of those states. Now, it is true that it didn't help that Hillary Clinton was the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. She was the most hated candidate in the history of candidates, with the exception of Trump. It is also true that cheating Bernie Sanders didn't help. It is also true that running a campaign while under a criminal investigation didn't help. It is also true that not going to Wisconsin didn't help. There's a host of things that did not help her cause. But way, way, way down that list, if it's on that list at all, it's not the Russians. Homegrown. Now, the delegitimization of Trump. The second point on that, and you can call it 2A, is that status quo didn't lose. Like, this wasn't this immaculate failure. It wasn't a situation where the most status quo candidate in the history of status quo candidates that has ever run a campaign, we were told that she was the most qualified candidate in the history of all physical matter realities, and even some non-physical matter realities, that was the person who should be president. It should be bestowed upon her like you would bestow somebody a king or a queen. They are trying to find ways to make the point that status quo didn't fail. This is somewhat of an undermining of the argument of lefties in this case. The lefty argument is that status quo utterly failed. It ran into a brick wall. It lost to a reality show host, a guy who had no political acumen, and on the day that he was elected, the majority of the population thought he was unqualified for the job. That guy beat the status quo candidate, beat the stuffing out of her if you're looking at the vote totals. I mean, after all, the only state, if it wasn't for California, she lost magnificently. She got the stuffing beat out of her. I guess my point is this. I've said that this is a Trojan horse. And not just that part, there's one more. Attacking lefties. So if you've noticed, one of the things that they've done was to try to attack the left and the right, making the argument of Russia. So the Russia propaganda, kind of like during the Cold War, where they would use that to stem the tide of how far to the left that you can go. You're looking a little red there, buddy. You better watch your mouth. Well, similar here. It doesn't necessarily have the same force as it did back during the Cold War time, but the effect is somewhat the same. Social media companies being browbeat in order to kind of constrain the level of dialogue, constrain anti-war voices. This argument that Black Lives Matter, environmental movements, all were somehow inspired by the Russians. Like, this stuff is nonsense. But this is the stuff that they were pushing in order to try to create a propaganda that it wasn't the fact that she failed, or it wasn't even the fact of Western society hitting the bricks. No, Trump, Russia, and the ubiquitous Russian that's behind all movements that are taking place. Right now, they are out there trying to say that Russia is behind what is taking place in France. This grassroots movement, this upswell, they're trying to say that that has something to do with the Russians. Just because RT is running this the show doesn't necessarily mean that it's done by the Russians. It's somewhat nonsense. It shows a somewhat discrediting of Western media that they can't necessarily own the fact that the society to which they've pushed for all these years, particularly from the standpoint of austerity, this favoring of the rich, favoring of the capitalistic class, has consequences. You're seeing a rebalancing. That's a consequence. But that's kind of besides the point. What I want to get at is, in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn, so there have been leaked documents, and those leaked documents are showing that an organization that was supposed to be a quote-unquote charity, and the charity was supposed to counter Russian propaganda, used this kind of stagecraft behind the scenes by organizing, pulling together media to make it look as if it's somewhat of an organic attack on what they consider to be propaganda, when really it was this kind of coordinated think tank that was given all of this money, taxpayer money, from the UK. Well, instead of them going after Russian propaganda, what they've considered to be Russian propaganda would just so happen to be Jeremy Corbyn. And the media account, the social media account, has been out there punching Jeremy Corbyn, one item after the next. And not just Jeremy Corbyn, people who are associated with Labour government has been attacked by this organization. And again, this is UK taxpayer-funded charity, supposedly, quote-unquote, charity that is run by some intelligence services or person who was affiliated or people who are affiliated with the intelligence services. This is an amazing story. The leak just came out. Let's take a look at this. Sorry if I'm dragging ass a bit. It's 2 a.m. here. A secret Scottish-based official led InfoWars attack on Labour and Jeremy Corbyn. Explosive leaked documents passed to the Sunday Mail reveal the organization's integrity initiative is funded with $2 million of Foreign Office cash and run by the military intelligence specialists. You don't say. I wonder if something like that taking place in the United States. I suspect it probably is. I mean, to give you an example, think of it as if in the United States they wanted to stem certain dialogue. So let's say they wanted to inhibit certain dialogue that they think has gotten legs. And so people like, let's say, Cedar and Dixon and Packman get kind of pulled together in this kind of a knit of sorts and put out attacks, making it look as if these attacks are somewhat organic, when these attacks are somewhat coerced by a particular party. In this particular case, though, it's this idea of Russian propaganda, but the Russian propaganda just so happens, at least in some situations, ends up being attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. It's one thing if they were doing it on their own, but if you're taking taxpayer money, and then you're attacking the government itself, you're supposed to be countering Russian propaganda, there's a problem there. There's a fundamental problem there. You're using this secret or this special set of skills, to take the word from that movie, in order to attack the number 2 person in that government, or the opposition leader in that government. That's problematic. A secret UK government-funded InfoWars unit based in Scotland sent out social media posts attacking Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. On the surface, cryptically named Institute for Statecraft, is a small charity operating in an old Victorian mill in Fife. But explosive leaked documents passed to the Sunday Mail reveal the organization's integrity initiative is funded by £2 million of Foreign Office cash and run by military intelligence specialists. The think tank is supposed to counter Russian online propaganda by forming clusters of friendly journalists and key influencers throughout Europe who use social media to hit back against disinformation. So understand the example. Let's say, for example, let's say this wasn't a foreign service. Let's say it was the Democratic Party. And let's say the Democratic Party thought that it had an issue with some lefties who weren't necessarily in its ranks. And so it would form organizations of lefties who were in its ranks. So it may have Hartman, Packman, Cedar, Dixon, Vote Hillary crowd, as if they were acting on their own autonomously, when really behind the scenes they're working on the same page. and then working on the same page, sending out coordinated attacks in order to stymie certain people that it didn't, let's say, didn't like the message of. In this case, it's Britain, and instead of it being a party, an intelligence service, where people run intelligence services, apparently being part of the people who are working there, running these secret clandestine operations in order to attack what they consider to be propaganda. And again, I emphasize what they consider to be Russian propaganda. And in this case, what they consider to be Russian propaganda, in many cases, just so happen to be Jeremy Corbyn. This is a bombshell. This is a bombshell. A think tank that is supposed to counter Russian online propaganda by forming clusters of friendly journalists and key influencers throughout Europe who use social media to hit back against disinformation. And by the way, Democratic Party was doing this too. I mean, when Bernie Sanders was running in the race, you would have people who were friendly to Hillary Clinton and who would put out information. In one case, I remember one guy said, look, I'm pretending to be friends with Bernie Sanders, so later on, I can just turn and make it look as if it's organic that I'm now supporting Hillary Clinton. Some of the stuff, like the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, don't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. But our investigation has found worrying evidence of a shadowy program official Twitter account has been used to attack Corbyn and Labour Party and their other officials. One tweet quotes a newspaper article calling Corbyn a useful idiot that goes on to state his open, visceral anti-Westernism helped the Kremlin cause, and surely as if he had been secretly peddling Westminster tattle for money. Wow. A message from the UK government-funded organization promotes an article that states, unlike Galloway, former MP George Galloway, Corbyn does not scream conspiracy, he implies it. While another added, it's time for the Corbyn left to confront its Putin problem. This is gaslighting. It should be familiar to you if you're in America, but that's what this is. These people aren't coming out in this organic way. This is an organization that is peddling certain information to try to influence the level of debate and the level of discourse. They're manufacturing a reality and pushing that reality. I would push to you that you should not be surprised, and you should also be on guard for something like this in the States, either through parties or through intelligence services to counter quote-unquote Russian propaganda. A further message refers to an alleged British Corbyn supporter who wants to vote for Putin. This is fucking amazing. His strategy and communications director, Sesmas, I guess that's Milne, was also targeted. The Integrity Initiative, let's put that in quotes, who's based at Gateside Mill, is near Authormuckety. Oh, I'm sorry, I butchered that. A retweeted newspaper report said, mine is not a spy, that would be beneath him. But what he has done, wittingly or unwittingly, is work with the Kremlin agenda. This is leader of the Labour Party. Taxpayer money going to attacking him in this way. Another retweet promoted a journalist who said, just as he supports the Russian bombardment in Syria, Milne supports the Russian slaughter of Afghanistan, which resulted in more than 1 million deaths. That's amazing. How many people have we killed in Afghanistan? I find the hypocrisy in this stuff to be fucking phenomenal. The Integrity Initiative has been accused of supporting Ukrainian politicians who oppose Putin, even when they have suspected far-right links. Well, if you remember, we've been supporting Nazis. These guys have been out there having Nazi marches and rallies, and we've been sending them weapons and financing, all in the pursuit of fighting Russians. It's amazing. The organization's Spanish cluster swung into action on hearing that Pedro Banos was going to be appointed director of the National Security Department. The paper details how the Integrity Initiative alerted key influencers around Europe who launched an online campaign against the politicians. I remember reading the original document of this. I was going to do a story on this, so I'm glad this came out. In the wake of the leaks, which also details government grant applications, the Foreign Office have been forced to confirm that they provided massive funding to the Integrity Initiative. Taxpayer taxpayer money going towards attacking leader of the opposition. In response to parliamentary question, your minister, Alan Duncan, said, in the financial year of 2017-2018, the FCO funded the Institute for Statecraft Integrity Initiative to the tune of £296,500. For the financial year, the FCO are funding a further £1,961,000 British pounds. Both have been funded through grant agreements. That's amazing. Labour MSP Neil Fiddley said, it would appear that they have a charity registered in Scotland and overseen by the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator that is funded by the UK government and is spewing out political attacks on the UK politicians, the Labour Party, and the Labour movement. That should be a mind-blowing thing. Such clear political attacks and propaganda shouldn't be coming from any charity. We need to know why the Foreign Office has been funding it. We need to know indeed. People have a right to know that the government is spending their money and the views being promoted in their name. Again, agreed. I mean, we passed the Ministry of Truth. We have no idea what that's doing behind the scenes in regards to the information that's being pushed and the lies that's being put on the American public as propaganda, and it's being okayed through that bit of legislation. So they contacted this guy. Documents passed to the Sunday Mail suggest he was appointed as honorary colonel in military intelligence in 2015, the year that the Integrity Initiative was formed. Papers we have viewed has also suggested that senior operative Dan O'Finney was a SAS soldier in 1978 and attached to a regiment which ran spy cells in Russia. After contacting the Integrity Initiative through its website to ask about the labor attacks, we received a call from the spokesman, Stephen Dalziel. He said, I'm not aware of that. I'm not the one who controls the Twitter account. If there was criticisms on one of our politicians, then that shouldn't have been there. No shit, Sherlock. We asked about the military background of the Integrity Initiative employees. Denzel denied any Secret Service involvement. Well, I mean, if it's Secret Service involved and it's a clandestine operation, they wouldn't necessarily outright tell you that, would they? Meaning there was no way to get a correct answer from that. There's no way to know whether the answer is true, because that's an answer where you can expect them to lie. How often have you been beating your wife? What do you mean, how often I've been beating my wife? Well, I mean, is the person going to own up to the fact that they've been beating the shit out their wife? He added, Chris Donnelly was in the TA for many years. All right, so the leaked documents show a funding application to the Foreign Office that details the unit's work. Further papers reveal the unit in Lithuania, which received overseas funding to support the new hub cluster creation and the educate cluster leaders and people in Vilnius and Infowar techniques. I was supposed to go there, actually. Instead of going to Warsaw, I was supposed to go to Lithuania. Lithuania was far more expensive for me to get to, so I ended up coming here. It's a $20 bus ticket as opposed to, $160 to get there. It's information warfare. And Britain apparently has clusters where they've pulled journalists together to pretend as if they're putting out stories that are real. I would put to you that this is not just Britain. I mean, from a logic standpoint, it is not going to be just Britain. If Britain is doing it, you could bet your bottom dollar that other governments are also doing it. It's gaslighting, clandestine gaslighting. So apparently the UK has been funding attack pieces on Jeremy Corbyn with taxpayer money. That's awesome. No, not InfoWars in that sense, not Alex Jones. They just mean information warfare, where they're putting out information in order to attack somebody and go after a particular person. That's all they mean by that. Propaganda coming to people at every direction. Yes. Post-truth society. Yes. It is destruction of truth. It's hard to know what's reality and what's not. It is far easier to pick a direction that you want to go, hold your shape, and go in that direction. Owning up and dealing with the fact that nothing is true. There are things out there that are real. What those things are, it's hard to necessarily pin down fully and completely what's absolute reality. What do you want to accomplish in the world? Take that direction and go. If you want to see a better world and you believe a better world is possible, take that and go in that particular direction. This stuff swirls around you, but oftentimes it's swirling around you in order to get you to dislike, to hate, or to take a particular disposition that's usually hostile to something. Ignore it all. Take your direction and go. Because otherwise it's hard to know what's absolutely true. So this one has gone far, far, far too long. But intelligence services are using this in order to destroy any notion of truth and destroy any notion of what's real. And you can see it's going to be somewhat successful. They can't necessarily hide something from you. They can, but in cases where information is coming out, especially in our particular society where the internet has all sorts of information, creating doubt is almost just as effective as hiding information. Because after all, how do you know what's true? So I'll end this here. Too long, that's what she said. Oh, that's funny, Andrew Church. That's funny. All right. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all. Women. In a free society, people will always be unequal. That's a religious belief. That's a religious belief. I don't know why you believe that. That's a religious belief. You were born in a system from the time that you were a zygote to the time now of a certain amount of inequality. That is all you know. And because that's all you know, you just assume that that's the way the world has to be. Those things are acts of policy. Those things are not acts of God. There's a difference in those things. I understand, you're being a Democrat and all that, and you're trying to come up with some rationale for the reason the world is the way the world is. But inequality is not something that has to be any more than a king or queen has to be. At one point, you would have been, attesting to the mountaintops that God appointed this king or God appointed this queen, and this always needs to be. When Britain fought a war against Parliament won that war. But they still said, well, king and queen is appointed by God, so you still need those things there. Your understanding of the world and the way you process the world is built purely on the way the world is constructed. And in the way that processing, you're making somewhat of a logical leap and thinking that because the way the world is this way, that the world always needs to be that way. That's nonsense. You don't know that. The world doesn't have to be this ridiculously unequal. And a better world is possible. From your standpoint, you consider yourself a Democrat, which means that for you, poverty, homelessness, all those things are built into the process. But for people who don't consider themselves just random Democrats and who look at the world and say, we can move this world in a better direction, those things are acts of policy. Those things are not acts of God. There's a difference in those things. You're mistakening just because the way the world is, that the world will always be this way, and that is not true. That's somewhat of a fallacy. Just saying. All right, I'll end this here. Thanks all.